The house on the edge of Willow Creek was too quiet. Even the kitchen radio, always tuned to some soft jazz station, didn't really play, just filled the silence between the sound of a knife steadily slicing celery. Helen moved like clockwork, chopping, rinsing, simmering. A rhythm built over decades, steady and precise. Something was bubbling on the stove. A chicken casserole warmed in the oven. A pitcher of wine chilled beside a bowl of ice. Everything was ready. 34 years. That's how long they'd been married. They didn't celebrate it anymore. Not really. But Helen still cooked. Not because she wanted to, because that's what you did. Her way of keeping the world in order, at least inside the kitchen. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped into the living room. Everything sat where it always had. Bookshelves stacked with titles Thomas hadn't touched in years. The gray couch, worn in the middle, where they both spent evenings together yet apart. The paintings on the wall, once chosen by her, now looked like they belonged in a hotel, decorative, emotionless. She opened the bottom drawer of the sideboard and found an old photo album. A picture slipped out, glided onto the carpet, and came to rest at her feet. She bent to pick it up and froze. A young woman stood beside an easel, short hair, paint smudged on her nose. She was laughing. Not at something, not for someone, just laughing from the joy of the moment. That was before the wedding. Before someone began correcting her tone around friends. Before the "why bother painting? You'll never sell any." Before "isn't accounting more practical?" She sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the photo. That night, Thomas came home at 7:20. As always, no call, no announcement. He tossed his coat onto the chair without looking her way. Over dinner he ranted about the news, how the country was falling apart, how people had lost their minds, how kids these days had no manners or education. Helen nodded, clearing the plates as he talked. She didn't argue. Not anymore. That's how you kept the peace. At least for him. "You should pay more attention to politics," he muttered, finishing his wine. "All you care about are recipes and art supplies. The world's not as soft as you think." She kept drying the dishes. His words didn't sting. They echoed like noise in an empty room. That night fell quietly. Thomas was asleep within minutes. Helen lay awake. The bedroom felt stuffy, so she cracked the window. A breeze from the creek lifted the curtain. The air smelled of damp earth, wet leaves, a trace of rain. It was familiar. Something she hadn't let herself remember. Back when she used to walk down to the stream with a sketch pad, hunting for light and shadows in the branches overhead. Something stirred in her chest. Not a memory. Not quite nostalgia. More like a spark under a blanket of ash. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. What she felt wasn't fear, more like unease. Not because of him. Not because of their marriage. Because of herself. Because somewhere along the way she'd gone missing. Not in one moment. Not in some dramatic fall. Just little by little. Like water slowly carving into stone. In the dark, she got up, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. Her fingers brushed the photograph still lying on the table. She didn't laugh like that anymore. But deep down, buried under years of quiet, something was still alive. Something that hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be her. Outside, the creek was whispering. And in that deep silence that had settled over the house, Helen heard herself, for the first time in years. Her routine, like the walls of the house, had seemed unshakable for years. But one morning, Helen didn't start the coffee pot at 6:45 like always. Instead, she pulled on a pair of old sneakers, tied her hair back, and slipped outside while Thomas was still asleep. The air was cool and crisp. A thin layer of mist hovered over Creek Road. The water shimmered between the trees like liquid silver. Helen stopped near the bank, not because she planned to, but because her body knew to pause. The same way it used to back when she was young and came here with a sketch pad. She used to sit on damp rocks for hours, just watching the light shift through the branches. This time she didn't sit. She simply stood there, watching the water move around the stones. No deep thoughts. Just a sense that something inside her had shifted. Like a window that hadn't been opened in years finally gave way. Back in the kitchen, Thomas glanced up from the newspaper. "You weren't here earlier. Thought you were still in bed." Helen nodded. No explanation. No apology. A week later, she told him she wouldn't be joining him at his college reunion. First time in 20 years. "I need a day to myself," she said. Short. Calm. He shrugged and didn't press. That evening she went down to the garage. Behind a stack of holiday boxes she found it. An old metal tin covered in dust. Inside, dried paint tubes, some cracked caps, brushes curled and brittle like grass left under snow. And still she remembered the colors. Carmine. Ultramarine. Raw ochre. Her fingers trembled a little as she twisted one open. The smell of oil paint hit her. A thick, earthy scent. It smelled like something real. Something that once belonged to her. She brought the supplies to the porch. There stood her old easel, weathered but still standing. She wiped it down, pulled out a blank canvas she bought long ago and never used. The first strokes were clumsy, like walking after a long illness. But something inside her stirred. Not all at once. Not loudly. Just returned. Thomas didn't notice. His days rolled on as they always had. The paper, the TV, dinner, sleep. Helen was to him like an old countertop. Familiar, worn in, easy to overlook. But someone noticed. June, the neighbor from 2 houses down, gray hair, small frame, soft voice, knocked one afternoon while Helen was trying to paint sunlight through the branches of a maple. "Your hands remember," she said, her eyes on the canvas. They sat together on a bench by the creek later that week. June sipped tea from a thermos. They said little. And then, almost in a whisper, "We can still become someone else. Even if it's been a long time since we believed it." The words lodged in Helen's mind like a melody that refuses to leave. That night she didn't sleep. Instead she imagined a different town. A smaller apartment. No routines. No familiar roles. No one expecting her to always fit. There wasn't a plan. But there was a want. And somewhere, quietly, a crack opened in the frame that had held her life in place. And through that crack, for the first time in years, light began to shine. In the light of the setting sun, her easel looked like stained glass. The drying paint caught the glow shades of ochre, cobalt blue, and deep green. Helen had just finished a landscape of the creek and pine trees. It wasn't a replica. It was a memory. And somehow it felt alive. She propped the canvas against the wall to dry, stepped into the kitchen to make tea, and heard his voice behind her. Cute little paintings. Like something a teenager would make. Thomas stood in the doorway, wineglass in hand, wearing that same half-smile he always wore before saying something that cut. He didn't ask what she'd painted, didn't look closely, just dropped his judgment and waited, like always, for her to nod, to agree, to put it all away. Something tightened in Helen's chest. But it didn't collapse. She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the kettle. Quiet. Steady. This time she didn't hide the paintings. Didn't close the paint box or tuck herself back into the role labeled accommodating. The next morning she drove into town. Bought herself a laptop, sleek, light, with a big screen. Then she signed up for an online color theory course. Paid for 3 modules in advance. She was 58. But nothing stopped her fingers from learning color again. Not formulas, not rules. Just feeling. That evening, Thomas noticed the empty box on the counter. "What's this? Another expense? You've got a TV and newspaper. What do you need toys like this for?" His tone wasn't angry, just weary. Like a man forced to drag someone back to what he thought was reality. Helen stood at the sink, drying a plate. Her hands slowed, stilled. She set the plate down, folded the towel, and turned to him. Calm. Unshaken. This is my life, Thomas, and I'm done waiting for permission to live it. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't even anger. It was a truth, spoken clearly, like saying your own name out loud after years of forgetting how it sounds. He didn't respond, just sank into his chair and turned on the news. The volume was louder than usual. That night, Helen didn't sleep in their room. She carried a pillow and blanket to the guest room. Not out of spite. She just couldn't go back into a space that felt so hollow. The night was quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the fence. Lying on the narrow bed, she stared at the ceiling. What she felt wasn't pain. It was something else. Fear. And freedom. They lived side by side inside her. Not fighting. Just coexisting. Like two wings, unfamiliar, a little frightening but built to lift. She knew pain would come again. Doubt too. But there was no going back. Something new had entered her life. Fragile still like a paper bird but real. And she wasn't about to let anyone crush it. The red brick building sat a little off Main Street, just past the coffee shop and across from the old post office. Inside it smelled like wood polish and worn paper. The receptionist, a soft-spoken woman with perfectly white hair, looked up and smiled. Second door on the right. Mr. Rose is expecting you. He hadn't changed much. Still the same furrowed brow, wire-rimmed glasses, and that quiet teacher-like voice he'd had back in high school civics class. But now he was an attorney, and he looked at Helen not as a girl from math club, but as a woman who had made up her mind. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he opened a thin file folder and began writing. Oregon's no fault. You're entitled to half of everything, pensions included, even if most of the contributions came from him. And yes, you can file without his permission. Helen nodded. Somewhere deep down it still felt strange that this was allowed. That she didn't have to wait for the world to give her permission to walk away. That she didn't have to carry the weight just because she always had. She paid the retainer, took a printed packet of instructions, and stepped back into the sunlight. It hit her eyes hard. The air was dry and sharp. Her fingers trembled, but not from the cold. At home she grabbed a notepad. Wrote, "Studio on Richmond, check if still available. Paint supplies restocked before fall. Market prep, frame 3 landscapes. Bank account new in her own name. Paperwork, license, insurance, taxes. Update everything. No euphoria. Just a quiet determination. Like standing barefoot at the edge of a cold river, knowing you'll wade in whether you're ready or not." Within a week, Thomas noticed. Her clothes weren't hanging beside his. The file folders she kept in the study were gone. He saw her talking on the phone, jotting things down, leaving the house at odd hours, without asking, without explaining. He didn't understand it. He didn't have the tools to decode that kind of silence. When she finally told him outright, his first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. "You're really filing? Over some paint and a laptop? Over freedom you handed to me years ago?" Helen stood in the kitchen, resting her hands on the counter, a mug of tea in her grip. No bitterness in her eyes, just clarity. Thomas slumped a little, his voice soft again. "You won't make it without me." Her reply was quiet and firm. "I already am." For the first time in years, her voice didn't shake. She didn't soften it with a smile, didn't scan his face to measure his reaction. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply stating a fact. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a scene. It was a bridge, one she had built inside herself, plank by plank. And now she was standing on it, looking forward. Thomas sank into his chair and lowered his head. And for the first time in their entire marriage, Helen didn't move to comfort him. This time she chose herself. The move wasn't dramatic. No boxes stacked to the ceiling, no tearful goodbyes. Just the essentials. 2 piles of canvases, her easel, a few books, an old blanket, paints packed in a plastic crate, and a mug that read, "Good things take time." a gift from June years ago. The apartment was on the second floor of a small building near Willow Bend Park. The park was old and quiet, with benches that creaked when you sat, and willow trees whose branches tangled overhead like old hands clasping. Mornings brought dog walkers. Evenings, older women with thermoses and seed tins for the birds. Her windows looked right out onto those willows. Their leaves fluttered gently in the breeze, like steady breathing, calm, slow grounding. She set up her easel near the window, strung a little garland of lights above the bed, made a spice shelf in the kitchen, full of jars she never would have bought before, because Thomas didn't like weird flavors. And one morning she made scrambled eggs with chili flakes and cilantro for herself. At the town market, she brought a few small paintings. A woman stopped by, looked closely, and said, "You paint without fear. Maybe not with full confidence yet, but definitely without fear." Then she bought 2 landscapes. Then came another woman. Then an email invitation from the public library, asking if she'd like to be part of a small community exhibit. Helen hadn't been chasing recognition. She didn't need it. She just kept doing what made her hands warm, what made her heart settle. At the senior center where June used to volunteer, they had a small art room. One afternoon, June made a quiet suggestion. Show them how to hold a brush. It's not about masterpieces. People just want to breathe while they paint. The room smelled like dust and old linoleum. Helen brought a vase of daisies, spread out palettes, hung a few of her pieces on the wall. 6 women showed up, ranging from 50 to 80. They sat in silence, holding their brushes like something sacred. At first, they barely touched the paper, but eventually they started to breathe. And that's how the Willow Room began. Not a class, not therapy, just a soft, quiet place for women who were tired of being how they're supposed to be. One woman brought cookies. Another brought music. One brought a folded sheet of paper with a poem she'd written and never shown anyone. None of it was work. None of it charity. It was life. A few weeks later, a letter appeared in her mailbox. She recognized the handwriting. Thomas. He asked if they could talk. Said he'd been thinking that maybe he'd changed. She held the envelope for a while, then tucked it into the box with her paints. She didn't tear it up. Didn't reply. Just didn't open it. Not out of anger, but because she no longer needed to know what it said. Whatever he had to say belonged to a past she no longer lived in. And Helen? Helen had moved on. 3 years passed quietly. Not because life had slowed down, if anything it had filled up. With people. With movement. With meaning. But time no longer dragged. When you stop spending your energy explaining yourself, time starts flowing like a river, steady and strong. Quiet strength. The words came to Helen during one of the Willow Room sessions. They weren't a slogan. They were a state of being. A name waiting to happen. She found the gallery space by accident. An old pharmacy on the corner of Willow and 6th, with tall windows, a faded sign, and a back room that once stored herbal remedies. Now it held paintings, not museum pieces. These were born from stillness, from experience, from the long, slow work of returning to yourself. The women who exhibited didn't have art degrees, but each carried a story. And through brushstrokes, some shaky, some sure, they said the things they'd never had words for. Helen chose the opening date carefully, the anniversary of the morning she first walked to the creek, back when her jaw was still clenched with doubt, but her feet had taken that first step anyway. The gallery smelled of wood and fresh paint. Along the walls, modest frames hung evenly spaced. Each had a plaque, not with the artist's name, but with her age and the first word she'd said out loud when she realized, "I exist." The room filled with familiar faces. June in a new beret. Mary from the library, now teaching collage workshops. Sarah, age 28, who had finally picked up a paintbrush after 5 long years. And a few younger ones, students, daughters, nieces, looking at Helen not like some grand figure, but like a map. A way forward. Helen stood beside a small podium. She held a piece of paper but didn't read from it. "I'm not an artist," she said, her voice calm. "I'm a woman who stopped apologizing for being alive." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was respect. For a moment the whole room held still. And that was enough. Across the room on the far wall hung her very first painting, the one of the night creek and the dark pines. It wasn't perfect, but it breathed. Beneath it, a small metal plaque read, "Not perfect, but free." This wasn't a finale, and it wasn't a triumph. It was the beginning of a new kind of space. A place where women, regardless of age or experience, could simply show up. No proving, no explaining, just be. That night, after the lights dimmed and the last guests had gone, Helen returned to her room. She sat by the window. The willows still swayed, just like always. But they looked different now. She hadn't become someone new. She had simply allowed herself to be who she'd always been. And that was enough.